Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Graham, and for those who may not know me, I serve as the Vice Provost in the Office of Student Affairs and University Life at System Administration. Let me give a most hearty welcome to everyone who is participating in this convening as we collectively celebrate 30 years of progress since the American Disability Act. Our theme today, celebrating diversity through disability in search of common values. We are timely and intentional about the importance of this work and the direct impact that it has on the lives of students, faculty, staff across our system, the state, and the nation. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the outstanding work and advocacy of our colleague, Nazli Kirkian. Many of you may know Nazli is the SUNY System-Wide Coordinator for Disability Services. She is an absolute joy to work with, and I am exceptionally proud of her. Nazli, thank you for your leadership. This session will be co-moderated by another outstanding colleague, Dr. Christopher Rosa, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Inclusion Initiatives at the City University of New York. Chris is more than a colleague to me. He is my friend. Chris will introduce our exceptional panel of experts who will share in their own way the perspective of students, thought leaders, and practice professionals. We are excited about your presence and look forward to an engaging afternoon. Before getting started, however, I have three very important housekeeping notes to share. The first, as we move through this conversation, if you have a question, please send it in the question and answer feature. Secondly, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please email specialevents@suny.edu. Today's ADA celebration panel offers sign language interpreting. If anyone wishes to only see the interpreters on your screen, please hover over their video and select Pin Video. Thank you to our interpreters, Lorelei and Tiffany. Let's get started. Why are we here? Why this conversation? Allow me to highlight some of the critical, important ADA milestones. When the ADA was passed, there was little to no technology. Microsoft Windows was invented in 1995, Windows 95. We're all familiar. The US worked on DOS computers with a white text on black screen, floppy disk, no mouse, and used F keys and arrows to move around. The ADA had the hindsight to add in wording to provide equality situations not conceived, to which I commend. In the 2008 ADA Amendments Act was just as historical. The definition of the term disability was clarified and broadening, making this law effective to those with medical situations such as HIV and AIDS and chronic illnesses. The clarity of web accessibility for equal access for all businesses was important to have a good experience for all, strengthened by the ADA Amendments Act. Employers and employees are finally set up and balanced following the Amendments Act in terms of supporting people with disabilities. I have witnessed the growth and support this law has provided to many, and still witness today the unfortunate unreliability of businesses not knowing what this law entails. The momentum and growth has been astounding, but we still have a need to push through and assist those that are not following the law. The COVID-19 pandemic is evidence that we need to have web accessibility for all, and I believe another disability movement for technology reform is in our midst. I would like now to turn your attention to Dr. Christopher Rosa, who will give brief remarks and introduce our panelists with one exception. Dr. Rosa.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, John. It's my honor to be here. John is my friend, my colleague, and my brother, and my wonderful partner in all things that pertain to creating meaningful access and opportunity for college students in New York State. You will not find a more student-centered leader than John Graham, and I'm honored to be here with you today. It's my privilege to be here on this wonderfully joyful occasion. Happy 30th birthday, ADA. You don't look a day over 29. But we've had tremendous progress over the last 30 years, and SUNY has really been at the heart of the meaningful progress that's been made around access and opportunity for New Yorkers with disabilities. And I just wanted to give you some contextualizing remarks before I introduce our remarkable panel, just so that you can have an appreciation for the impact of access and opportunity that SUNY makes on our state and beyond. As all of you know well, because of its affordability and abiding commitment to access, SUNY campuses have become a national first choice destination for people with disabilities to pursue higher education. According to the State Department of Education, there are more than 75,000 college students in New York State who have self-identified as students with disabilities. And close to 40% of those students are enrolled at SUNY campuses. That's an achievement about which all of you should be very proud. HEAP, which is a national clearinghouse for data and information on post-secondary education and disability, estimates that for every college student with a disability who are known to our campuses, there are likely to be 2 others who are eligible for reasonable accommodations, but who have not identified themselves as individuals with disabilities, either because of a lack of awareness that the conditions that they're experiencing constitute disabilities that are protected under the ADA, or because of the stigma that's still associated with disability in our culture. This means that there may be as many as 90,000 students with disabilities enrolled at our SUNY campuses. And while the population of students with disabilities in our state has grown dramatically over the past 30 years, certainly buoyed by the promise of equal access and opportunity created by the ADA, quite frankly, New York State's investment in the capacity of our campuses to provide reasonable accommodations and support services has just not kept pace with this exponential growth. This is why I'm particularly proud to work with great SUNY leaders like Nasli Kirch and Kathy Carlson and Tamara Mariotti to support students from SUNY, CUNY, and private institutions to build a true statewide movement and coalition in support of access and equity for students with disabilities across our state. So what have we all learned from this movement, this community to which we belong? We've learned that the ADA is not only a powerful legal document, John referred to its legal impact, transforming access and opportunity for people with disabilities across our country. It's more than a very significant political document, a political achievement, one of those rare ones which was passed through broadly based bipartisan support of both houses of Congress, which seems unimaginable in this day and age. But it's first and foremost a cultural document. It's ones that capture the aspirations, the values of our country, and our expectations for how we ought to regard individuals with disabilities. And what do we imagine their life chances are in contemporary American life? And I just wanted to leave you with just a few brief reflections on the ADA as a cultural document. First of all, the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, not the Handicapped Americans Act, not the Individuals with Special Needs Act, not the Individuals with Different Abilities Act. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's chosen the language that people with disabilities have claimed to describe themselves and their own experiences. It underscores that first and foremost, people with disabilities in our nation are Americans first, with the same goals, hopes, and aspirations and dreams as all other Americans. But they're also people who are increasingly fiercely proud of their identities as individuals with disabilities and are part of a movement that are remaking the face of American society in their own image and redefining what it means to be an individual with a disability in contemporary American life. Secondly, the core concept of the ADA is that of reasonable accommodation. And for those of us who know reasonable accommodation, it is a concept that at its heart requires that the playing field be leveled for individuals with disabilities in all aspects of American life. And it doesn't seek to advantage individuals with disabilities in any way. It just gives them an equal opportunity to succeed or fail, but based on their merit alone. And that is the way in which people with disabilities increasingly have come to aspire to their existence as Americans, as people with the same goals and dreams who are just looking for an equal chance free of barriers in order to succeed or fail, but again, on their merit alone. And finally, the ADA has really transformed expectations of young people, especially with disabilities. But the generations of students who are now coming to our colleges in New York State increasingly have grown up with the ADA, equal access and opportunity, as an expectation. They expect to be included. And our challenge as higher ed institutions is to meet those students where they are, to make sure that we are positioned to meet their expectations for equal access and full participation in all aspects of college and university life. And so at this moment, I'm very, very honored to introduce our really distinguished panel, who will lead us in a discussion of what it will take for all of us to meet the expectations of individuals with disabilities at our higher ed institutions, promise of the ADA. We're thrilled to be joined by a very distinguished higher education leader, ninth president in the history of Buffalo State College. Please welcome Dr. Catherine Conway Turner. Dr. Conway Turner, thank you for joining us. I'm also very happy that we're joined by the director of the Office of Accessibility Services at Columbia Green Community College and the president of the New York State Disability Services Council, my dear, dear friend and colleague, Kathy Carlson. Kathy, thank you for being with us today. We're also very pleased to be joined by the CEO and founder of Our Ability, an organization providing inclusive workforce and employment consulting, mentoring, workshops, and seminars on disability and diversity. Please welcome a true statewide leader, John Robinson. John, thank you for being with us here today. Finally, offering arguably the most valuable perspective that we'll hear today, a representative of Buffalo State College's accessibility team. Please welcome outstanding student leader, Victoria Everett. Victoria, thank you for being here with us today. I am going to turn it over to my partner in crime, John Graham, for one last and special panelist introduction.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. I want to very briefly introduce Stacey Kingston. She's the president and CEO of Special Olympics New York, which is the largest Special Olympics chapter in the country and the 6th largest in the world. I would like to share a very quick story, if I may. When I joined SUNY System in 2016, it was Stacey who proactively reached out to me to join her weekly review team meetings. She was not working on a white paper for inclusion because she was too busy doing it. Stacey, I never forgot what you did for me. I felt welcome. And that is the very same thing that our students, faculty, staff, and people from all over the world are hoping for, to be intentionally included and welcome. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, John. That was very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you,
most welcome.
Stacey. Welcome, and John, thank you for that beautiful reflection. So I'd like to begin our panel discussion with a question about the arc of progress over the past 30 years of the ADA. And my first question is for President Conway Turner. President Conway Turner, as the leader of a premier higher education institution in our state, could you please describe the role that senior leadership plays in creating meaningful access and opportunities for people with disabilities in all aspects of university life?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Chris, for the question. And first, I want to say how honored I am to be on this panel with these amazing leaders in the field. And of course, my student, Victoria. It's really great to be here to have this conversation. I'm really feel very fortunate to be at Buffalo State College, an institution who really understands the importance of providing the right opportunities for our diverse students, which include students with disabilities. I have been in higher education all of my life, over 30 years, and both Buffalo State and then also my years at University of Delaware has really provided me a really great perspective to share with you today. There are many things that leaders think about every day. There are many problems that come across our desks, but central to all the work we do is in higher education, how do we meet the needs of each and every student that we have on campus? And we know that our students come with vast differences in terms of needs. And so students with disabilities come from a whole array of backgrounds, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, learning disabilities, all kinds of backgrounds. And so what leaders really should do, and what we spend time doing here at Buffalo State, is really recognizing that diversity. So what does that mean? So when you have students that are coming to you with these varied backgrounds and varied needs, it means that every student needs to be looked at as an individual. And you really need to understand what it takes for he or she to succeed. And what do we need to do to provide the support for that student? So our Center for Accessibility Services has been around since 1988, so it's been around for a long time. It has continued to grow and refine the services that are provided as we have brought on different students, and sometimes we have a new student has a totally different need than we've seen before. And the possibility of looking at students as individuals and developing those support systems is so very important. So today, 30 years after ADA, one of the things I can say from a leadership perspective is that students with disabilities are in our mind whenever we build a building, whenever we're creating new curriculum, whenever we're having an experiential education opportunity, whenever we start a new program. You really have to think about how all of those things would need to be connected to a student with a specific need. So it really requires a layered and a multi-dimensional way of thinking about education. So it's not just about the physical ramps and the doors, which are certainly very important. Just a quick story. Years ago when I was at SUNY Geneseo, I had a student who came to me and she had a temporary disability. And she said, I had no idea what it takes for a student with a physical disability to traverse Geneseo. If you've been to Geneseo, it's on a hill. We have this hill called the Cardiac Hill. It's really hard to get around. And so she became such an ally to our students on campus to understand, help other people understand the physical constraints. So the physical constraints are things that people often think about, but I often think about sort of the universal design. How are we designing courses? And how are we delivering the pedagogy, the curriculum, so that students really have access? Do we have assistive technology that we need? Is every website accessible? Have we really created the right accommodations? So those are the kinds of discussions that we have every day through our Center for Accessibility Studies, but across the campus. because we realize that we're not meeting the needs unless we're looking at it in a very layered and complex way. We oftentimes bring experts to campus and talk with faculty and talk with staff to further develop a knowledge and understanding of what's going on. As I said, that I'm advantaged by being at Buffalo State because it's been since 1953 that we had special ed on our campus. And even in the 1970s, we had inclusive classrooms at Buffalo State. So I really have people who understand, I have experts on all these different areas. And so in some ways, I feel very fortunate. I talk to other colleagues who have to work harder to get colleagues to understand how we need to continue to grow. But I feel very fortunate. So a lot has been done. A lot will continue to need to be done so that the kinds of discussions that those of us who have deep understanding happen on every campus and not just on some of our campuses. So I'll leave you with that to get us started.
Thank you so much, President Conway Turner. I think it's a very powerful insight from the ways in which senior leaders at our campuses can take the lead in transforming our campus communities around access and opportunity for individuals with disabilities. I'd like to pivot now to civic engagement. We all know that the ADA in many respects is about fostering full citizenship for individuals with disabilities. And so I'm going to ask our panel, in which ways is civic engagement important to holistic development and fostering of access and opportunities for students with disabilities? And I'd like to begin with my friend and colleague, Kathy Carlson. Kathy?
Thank you, Dr. Rosa. Civic engagement has been a very important and sort of a very consuming topic for many of us recently. In disability studies and disability services and in other areas, but specifically, there are so many important causes in stakeholders in our very complex society, and there will always be a need for responsive change. And that's where civic engagement comes in. Change only occurs when enough people gather together to be heard as a collective unit, to lend legitimacy and strength to the cause. In the disability rights community, we have just found that legislative action fosters access to our learning programs and our campus resources. And when it comes to legislative action, numbers matter, right? Numbers matter. Voting constituents matter to elected officials, because elected officials have a responsibility to speak for the people who have voted them into office, right? Holistic development begins with camaraderie and support for our students to make them feel important. It has a tendency to legitimize experiences, to turn ideas into action, and just sort of transform a discussion into a movement. So for the last 2 years, there has been a realization on our part, directed and led by Dr. Christopher Rosa and his colleague Steve Conway at the City University of New York, that New York State's investment in students with disabilities in higher education has not kept pace with the increased numbers of enrolled students with disabilities, and Dr. Rosa spoke to that earlier. From that realization, several separate groups have come together to form the New York State Coalition for Disability in Higher Education, in an effort to make our voices heard to the New York State Senate and the New York State Assembly. The effort is essentially was undertaken to educate our elected officials of the need for funding within the higher education line of New York State combined budget to support our students with disabilities. This effort has gained momentum. It's built a feeling of solidarity among our students, again, supporting and fostering the holistic needs of our students and giving them a purpose to become involved in civic engagement.
Thank you, Kathy. And as you mentioned, the movement you described has really been built by a very committed group of empowered student leaders. So Victoria, I'd like to ask your perspective on the role of civic engagement in empowerment and your development as a student leader.
Well, I think definitely kind of adding on to that kind of talk is how we kind of just need to start, I think about in a student perspective, just constantly asking what we need and what we want to see on campuses and thinking of how higher administration and things like that can definitely be asking more questions, taking surveys, those sort of things. Um, yeah, that's part of it that I think.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you so much for helping to lead the way on this movement to achieve meaningful investment in our campuses and capacities to serve outstanding students like you. I'm going to pivot now to the topic of employment and workforce participation. Over the past 30 years, I ask our panel, what are the ways in which the ADA has impacted employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities? And I'd like to begin with a real statewide leader in this space, John Robinson. John?
Thank you. Employment has expanded in many ways in the last 30 years and really in some ways not so. I'll give you the negative first, and then I'll give you the positive. The negative is the unemployment rate for individuals with disabilities really has not changed in 30 years. And despite federal efforts, despite state efforts, there's still a disconnect between the business community, the greater business community, state government, and individuals with disabilities that want to work. And now for the positive news. I think what we've done is we've done a wonderful job in inclusion in grade school, in junior high school. We have fallen off to some degree in high school and through the college years and the transition years if somebody isn't going to college. And then we've expected better outcomes in employment from corporate America without that middle period of time. And I am a product of a university education. It made all the world of difference to me. I'm thankful that I achieved that. But then I also, in 1990, at the time that this was authored and signed, and by that I mean the ADA, I was still not welcome to be employed. And so I interviewed with television stations around the country, with television networks in New York City and Toronto, Ontario, and was not welcome for 4.5 years. So that employment period of time at the beginning of the ADA really formed my opinion. Where we are good is part of what you've talked about with civil engagement, part of what we've talked about with inclusion, part of what we've talked about in universal design. Businesses are finally coming to this position in the last 5 years that they're going to start building jobs inclusively, including individuals with disabilities. They're going to continue to build business resource groups and affinity groups and include individuals with disabilities and their allies. And allies are really important because they're family members. And when you start from that perspective, then you realize the trickle down will come through, that the outreach to the college and university system and specifically the CUNY and SUNY schools will occur, that the training programs that we can provide or the connection points that we can provide with corporate America will occur, that the ask for further inclusion in college education programs for all individuals with disabilities and high school programs and transition programs will occur. And so while we may not have moved the needle so much, we are creating the activity that will achieve better outcomes. And it's not something that will happen overnight. And that's one of the things that as an individual with a disability that's lived his whole adult life under the ADA, sometimes we expect things to be at a snap of a finger much different. And the truth is, this is a very young movement. And we have to give ourselves a little bit of a pass to understand that we're comparing ourselves against others, and we shouldn't. What we should expect is to make improvements each and every day. As Victoria said, be vocal, ask for things, be out, be proud. And in this education setting, to ask for training and education around specific outcomes that can provide me job opportunities. One quick anecdote. I speak every year to incoming freshmen with disabilities at Syracuse University. And every year I've got 75 freshmen with disabilities and 150 parents around the table. And I ask the 225 people, why are you here? And it takes a good 5 minutes to get a student to say they're here for a job. We have to remember what we're here for. And what we're here for in this collective group is economic opportunity for individuals with disabilities. We can help that with employment outcomes. The SUNY and CUNY system can help that with education that lead to employment outcomes. And ultimately that employment outcome allows better economic empowerment. And that's what we're excited about at Our Ability.
Thank you very much, John. And just to underscore John's, I think, very insightful point, I think that the pandemic and its economic impact has really disproportionately impacted individuals with disabilities. Recently, the Kessler Institute issued an analysis that demonstrated while the national workforce participation rate has declined by 14% during the pandemic, it's declined by 20% among Americans with disabilities. But yet, in this sort of very difficult time, we see the seeds of opportunity. For example, how many of us thought that we can conduct all of our work remotely through digital platforms? We would have said it was impossible. And the fact that we're all doing it and still able to serve our students, I think is very heartening for individuals with disabilities where I otherwise encounter all manner of barriers, that this might be a liberating strand of opportunity for individuals with disabilities. So John, thank you for making that very, I think, incisive point. Speaking a little bit about barriers, I wanted to turn to our colleague Stacey and ask her to describe some promising approaches and best practices in raising awareness of barriers encountered by individuals with disabilities, and then some strategies for removing those barriers. Stacey?
Oh, I'm so engrossed in the conversation, I forgot to unmute. Thank you, Chris. And John, I took notes really as you were talking. I think I just want to underscore again what John said. I mean, the bad news he said for a second, but the ADA did not change the employment rate. The unemployment rate is twice as much for people without disabilities, but that was just a little bit of what you were saying when you could have talked really all about that. That is pretty disappointing, but your hope, and I wrote, creating more activity to get more outcomes. That's the right approach. And I think in all the things we've been reading about the ADA and the signing 30 years ago was really by
Ladies and gentlemen, we're just experiencing a little delay with Stacey Kingston. We're going to be working on getting her video back. Chris, do you mind just taking it on just for a little bit? Thank you.
Sure, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Sorry about the technical difficulties. At this moment, maybe we could talk a little bit about compliance. And as in our John's opening remarks, he traced the arc of ADA compliance over the last 30 years. And I wanted to ask our panelists, how does ADA compliance in higher education in 2020 differ from compliance in 1990 when the ADA was enacted? And I'd like to begin with President Conway Turner, just for her reflections as a senior leader.
Absolutely. So of course, with the regulations around ADA, it has increased the focus on compliance to really keep people focused on what they need to do. One of the things in, I think any field, but certainly in our field of higher education, that when you have to report and when you have to document, it really increases your likelihood of doing what you need to do. So it has really changed. But, I want to go back a little bit to something that John said earlier and just kind of follow up on that. And I'll tie it in with compliance as well. The bridge between students going through K through 12 and college. And you mentioned that as kind of a sticky place. And one of the things that I think is really important is that you have to really help students understand that college is an opportunity for them. And sometimes it really requires you bringing students on campus in a very deliberative way. So we have an Access Buffalo State College program where we actually bring people on campus for a week, and we teach them various skills and help expose them to college. And I think that those kinds of bridges are what are really needed. And in doing those, that really helps us to really fully comply with the specifications of providing an opportunity to all students with disabilities, that we need to show them that the representation of students with a disability is not just okay to have on campus, but it is something that we really want to have on campus. And there's nothing like giving you exposure to allowing you to see that you are a valued part of our community, not a second thought, but a valued part. So I think that in terms of really complying to the spirit of ADA, then we have to really create these bridges to allow people to be on our campus in ways that experience it early and often so that they see it as a good option for themselves.
Great. Thanks so much, President Conway Turner. I asked my colleague, Kathy Carlson, who is really working moment to moment on these issues each and every day. Kathy, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
President Conway Turner, I am so pleased to hear you say that the focus really needs to be on the spirit of the law rather than the regulations that are following under the law. I think over the last 30 years, there's been sort of a philosophical shift in how we view compliance in higher education services. Shortly after the passing of the ADA on July 20th, 1990, compliance was viewed sort of as a legal green light to develop accommodations and modifications and academic adjustments to allow people with disabilities access to education. When that opportunity arose to consider accommodation, the effort was underway to meet the mandates by changing the manner in which the student engaged with the educational process. And I believe students were truly at that time grateful for the opportunity. There was great applause for the effort to include students with disabilities to the programs offered by higher educational institutions. Access was defined sort of by what the institutions provided for students with disabilities, right? Even if it meant altering the student experience. That to me is problematic. Disability was being viewed from the lens of a problem solver, and disability was the problem, right? That's sort of the way that was looked at. It was viewed somewhat as a medical condition. Institutions endeavored to find a way to cure the student. We were absolutely following a medical model when determining accommodations. And as time wore on, it became clear that disability was not necessarily something that needed to be fixed. And a new philosophical approach began to form, which followed more of a social model, a model which sprang from the belief that were it not for the restrictions imposed by the environment, there would be no need for accommodations and modifications or academic adjustments. So in the 1990s, the concept of universal design began to take form in all areas of higher education. And from that emerged what we now call the social model of disability, institutions began challenging themselves to look at learning materials and programs from several different avatars, as I guess the term we use now. So looking at it from the view of a blind person, from the view of a hearing impaired person, from the experience of a learning disabled person. And programs were beginning to change at the point of design. And that's the most important thing I think that we've learned over the 30 years is let's not try and fix the problem after the fact. Let's start looking at it from the point of design. We have to ask ourselves, are we truly inclusive? So I think that these philosophical shifts over the years have left me ever mindful every time I think about this topic and every time I talk to a student, really. The ADA is always the floor, not the ceiling. If we focus on what we're required to do, we're missing half of our opportunity to meet the needs of the diverse learners that populate our campuses. That's the first thing I think about. The second thing I think about is the best way to create truly inclusive programs is to really absorb and appreciate the concepts of universal design and the social model of disability. Before we can begin to practice inclusion, we have to create a learning environment which supports diversity and equity.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you for reminding us of the underlying principle of universal design, which creates the most access for the most individuals. And Stacey, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I caught you mid-sentence.
I know, I was brilliant, wasn't I?
Staggeringly so.
I know.
And so you were in the midst of talking about promising approaches and best practices in raising awareness of barriers encountered by individuals with disabilities and some strategies for ameliorating them.
Yeah, so I'm going to say my brilliant stuff first so it doesn't happen again because now I have no confidence. But at Special Olympics, we work with people with intellectual disabilities. So I just want to say that from the get-go. Some of them do have physical disabilities, but it's intellectual disabilities. We beat the ADA by about 20 years. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We might take a do-over for next year because it wasn't exactly the year we were planning. But we work in all areas to have a more inclusive world for people with disabilities. So yes, we are a sports program, but we have athlete leadership programs. We work on health disparities for people with intellectual disabilities. And what I was saying before I was so rudely disconnected myself was what the ADA did also was it eliminated a stigma. It showed the world that people with disabilities matter. It showed really the world, not just the United States, but look what we're doing 30 years ago. So I think that same thing, but like John said, creating more programs to put that into play. Building a unified generation is what Special Olympics works on right now. So we're building a pipeline of people that in high schools and elementary schools through colleges that play on the same sports team with and without disabilities, same sports team, interscholastically against each other. So not only is it a great opportunity for the person with a disability, because let's face it, I mean, math class is important and English class is important, but true inclusion happens in your sports, in your extracurricular activities. That's also what you get to put on your resume, right? Not just I got access to go to school. What did you do in school? Who did you meet? How did you get those leadership opportunities? So we have we have 250 schools across New York State working with the colleges. What a great opportunity to then take that unified generation and move it up. So what they're learning at a very young age is the importance of including everybody. So when they go to corporate and they go to the worlds, they already have this ingrained because of the unified program, which I just think is so important. And seeing CUNY and SUNY doing this together, the impact those two systems have is massive and could really show the world who the unified generation is, which we're very excited about. We partner with the New York State Industry for the Disabled on our athlete leadership program. So when our athletes are not training their sports season, they are able to take courses to get them employment, get them ready to be employed. Even simple things as doing a PowerPoint or, doing the Zoom call. I need to take a few courses myself, but you know, that is those types of things. We know we have leaders, we have athletes, but let's give them those job training skills and introduce them to the companies so they can find the right fit for them too. So I think, you know, programs like that, keep on doing that. It's going to change an entire generation and advance the goals for the ADA.
Thank you very much, Stacey. And I wanted to get back to an earlier theme that Kathy had built upon in terms of the distinction about ADA compliance in 1990 and where we are in 2020. At the heart of that issue has to do with the definition of disability. And I wanted to ask our panel, how has the expansion of the disability definition changed the ways in which we think about reasonable accommodations and who ought to be considered for reasonable accommodations? And I'll start with John.
The expansion of the definition of disability has certainly opened the door to a better conversation around reasonable accommodation. I think in the the 1990 days, it's obvious if I walk in, I'm a person with a disability. There are some obvious times when somebody with an intellectual disability walks in and you know that they have a disability. But the expansion of the definition to include people with more hidden disabilities, people that are in the workplace, people that still need opportunity, has helped the general conversation around reasonable accommodation to get to the point of what is reasonable. And this is what's key to me. When I took a job at the channel, a TV station here in Albany that was on second and third floor with no elevator, it was not a reasonable accommodation for me to ask the TV station to put in an elevator. It was a reasonable request to ask them to move my desk downstairs. And so I think we have to understand what is reasonable, and we have to look at reasonable as a two-way street. And the reason I say that, I come at that from the perspective of the individual with a disability. I wanted the job. And so because I wanted the job, I was going to be much more reasonable in an accommodation than demand something that was unreasonable. You know, now today, 2020, you know, there are many conversations that can be had around what is reasonable for somebody that is on the spectrum with Asperger's or autism, or that someone who has epilepsy, or somebody that's got diabetes and has to go to birthday parties all the time in the old days in offices, right? We can get to a better conversation around reasonableness if we understand the breadth of disability is more than just an amputated limb, living in a wheelchair, or Down syndrome. It is so much more. And we have to be able to present ourselves in a more reasonable light so that we can get to the accommodation that we need to do the job. And I'm really, really, really pleased that this question came up and that we're able to talk about this in 2020 in a much more open way and not in a hidden way as it was in 1990. Because you know what, in 20 more years, the understanding of reasonable accommodation will be out and in front of everybody, and we won't have to have this conversation.
Thank you, John. Kathy, could you add, please, your thoughts on disability and definition and the way in which it's changed in the last 30 years?
Yeah, I think, you know, the body of law that really helped us with this was the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, which was passed in January of 2009. And there was a very good reason for that body of law to be passed. And the need for that body of law was a series of rulings, of cases, in which the plaintiff was attempting to sort of narrow the definition of disability. And of course, the reason for that, why would you want to narrow the definition of disability, right? Well, the reason that you do that is because, or the reason that there would be an effort to do that is to deny people the entitlement under the law, the Americans with Disabilities law, to eliminate the jurisdiction, really is the reason why that would happen. So there was a lot of case law surrounding, well, is this person really a person with a disability? Do they fit the definition of disability? And then again, getting back to the earlier discussion, the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act really brought us back to the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law is to ensure equity and create access for people that are experiencing a limitation in one area, which can be accommodated reasonably to ensure that they have the same opportunity as people without disabilities. All it really is, and somebody else said this term earlier, is leveling the playing field for people with disabilities. Not asking for anything more than a student without a disability would have, or asking for an advantage over a student without a disability, just asking to level the playing field.
Thank you, Kathy. Hearkening to the theme of this gathering, which has to do with disabilities' contribution to diversity, I'd like to ask our panel to describe how students with disabilities' intersectionality impacts their advocacy and their ability to build coalitions. This was a conversation that began earlier with President Conway Turner. So if you could maybe get us started on this discussion.
Absolutely, and I think this is a great discussion to follow up the broadening of the definition of disability as well. Because the reality is that few people are one anything, so that you come with multiple identities. You may come with multiple disabilities, but you also come with multiple other things going on. You can be, a person that's Black and brown and also have a disability, you're a female or a male or what. So the intersectionality of it is really important to understand the totality of the person. So whenever you restrict any individual to being one part of their dimension, you don't fully understand the full person. And so therefore, how could you possibly accommodate sort of their need? So, so the first thing I want to say is that, we need to recognize that people come in lots of different ways. And so that we're rarely just one anything. So what is important is that people do not have to choose which one of their parts of themselves they're advocating. You're advocating with your full self, with all of the pieces of you. And to the extent that people can understand the intersectionality of us as humans, really allow us to find allies, perhaps in ways that we didn't think we had allies before, and to see the commonality in the needs that we have. And I think that universal design, whether you're talking about universal design in terms of the physical realm or the teaching and so forth, is a place where we really understand that. You're really talking about people in their full array of their pieces and what makes up that person. That allows us to advocate together, that allows us to be stronger of a voice, to understand how that various issues are my issues and your issues and that other person's issues. So it does make us stronger in every way. I think it makes us stronger as individuals to understand our intersectionality, but it also, for advocates for ourselves, it also makes us stronger.
Thank you, President Conway Turner. Victoria, we'd love to hear your perspective on disability intersectionality and how it empowers students with disabilities to advocate and build coalitions.
Yeah, I think President Turner really had good points about it. And I think kind of to make it more practical, I kind of want to add a point on like how we could possibly even start creating safe spaces to have these conversations, because these conversations are very important for all of us to be having, like, maybe, talking about advocacy. I really like, it's one of the biggest things that I really like talking about, even for someone with and without a disability, for people to come together and just, having panel discussions like this, or creating events on campus where we can do workshops and have people ask questions and answer them. And it just creates the community-wide perspective and start talking to each other. And for me personally, participating in those conversations and things like that really helps me to build my confidence in myself and really makes me feel empowered. Rather than just being accommodated, I can feel celebrated. And
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that insightful answer from the lived experience of a student with a disability on the campus. We appreciate that very much. I wanted to turn to Stacey to discuss an emerging community at New York State colleges and universities. Increasingly, we're seeing individuals with intellectual disabilities turning to colleges and universities for education, training, and independent living skills. And Stacey, from your perspective, what are the emerging issues that New Yorkers with intellectual disabilities will be facing over the next decade, and how can we better position higher ed institutions to make an impact on these issues?
Thank you. I think, well, first and foremost, you're educating the next generation. You're educating the unified generation. So the impact that higher makes just across the board on how you as an institution work with people with disabilities, how you teach about it. I mean, that makes the impact right there. An issue that is very concerning to me, Special Olympics New York, but also to me as a mom. I have a 16-year-old with Down syndrome. I think President Conway Turner was talking about in education, you rarely make a decision these days without thinking about how this person with a disability, how, you know, the accommodations for that person with a disability. Where we're not seeing that is in the medical field. There is zero training in medical school on treating a person with a disability, an intellectual disability. Zero. There's not a question on the boards. There's no training that's mandated at all. So while the ADA might have opened the door to the hospitals, people can get in there, they're not getting trained by anyone that has any knowledge on how to treat people with intellectual disabilities. So the outcome of this is people with ID die 16 years younger on average than person without, not because of their disability, mind you, but because of that lack of access to, not access, it's not even about access, but good quality care. So what the SUNY and CUNY could do is change that. The dental schools, they set the precedent. They have policed themselves. I don't know if I want to say the word police themselves. They have changed their own requirement. So to be a dentist, you now do have to take, there's a requirement that you have to take courses and training on people with intellectual disabilities. Medical schools could do the same thing. Starting off with SUNYs and CUNYs together, just making that decision that it's a requirement would change health disparities for people with intellectual disabilities, starting from that doctor that day. So I think that wouldn't say it's an emerging issue, but it's something that has not kept up with the spirit of the ADA in the training of our medical professionals.
Thank you very much, Stacey. It's an important reminder of the prominence that our institutions of public higher education have and the impact that it makes in our communities. And it's a great resource that we could leverage for systematic and cultural change. And so we appreciate the reminder of our obligation and the opportunity that lies before us. Thank you. So I've been hogging all the questions, and the panel is remarkable. And I know that our audience would love to have the opportunity to ask some questions of our panel. So my colleague and friend, Nasli Kirchen, will be moderating the question and answer portion of our panel. Nasli, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Rosa, and good afternoon, everyone. There are a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with one that I think would be a great question for John Robinson. John, what are the main barriers to entry into the widespread workforce? Are there preconceptions that need to be challenged? Is it that corporate America lacks the confidence to provide for accommodations? Are they unwilling to provide for accommodations? A lot of questions in that question, but I I know you can see it.
Thanks, Nasli. Thanks for the tough one. So Mark, I saw this question come in and I love it. And it's so nuanced and yet it touches everything. So here you go. Are there preconceptions that need to be challenged, and are there barriers? Obviously there are barriers, or we would have been lower than the 70% unemployment rate. But one of the barriers that is maybe not as high as we think it is corporate America. In this conversation of disability employment, from individual with a disability to parent to educator to state agency to agency that is assistive, the employer is the easiest one today. It was not the case in 1990 or the year 2000. The 50 businesses that we work with around the country just want to hire people that get the job done. It's one of the nice outcomes of an inclusive movement. It's one of the nice outcomes of inclusive schools is that, sure, there is some discrimination. I don't want to diminish that. But the lowest hurdle is the business. The businesses we work with just want to hire people that can work and that will show up on time. And then when I say this, that businesses that hire individuals with disabilities will save money because there's more retention, there's less training costs, so that's more profit to the bottom line, and that individuals with disabilities that get work will stay 7 times longer. Those are dollar signs to businesses today. And so the business community gets it. Then it comes to a matter of how do they ask a question that is welcoming to an individual with a disability, that allows the individual with a disability to ask about a reasonable accommodation. And it's a two-way street conversation that both are afraid to have. And so a lot of our work is to get both sides of the bridge to be willing to ask questions. A business cannot ask a question about a disability. They cannot do that. What they can ask is, if I walk into the business and I'm going to sell advertising at the TV station, the question that can be asked is, how am I going to get the job done? And in my answer, there should be an accommodation if I need one. You see, what is true is that no matter who applies for what job, the job needs to be done. The function of the job needs to be performed. And so as long as we ask questions and answer questions around job function, then we're away from all of this headache. I have not run into many businesses that are unwilling to provide a reasonable accommodation. What I do find is people with disabilities and their families and their providers are afraid to ask responsible questions, and businesses are afraid to offend. And so we've got to come to some commonality to be able to have that conversation so we can just get the work done. And the 50 businesses that we work with do that, and they use us at times to do that, and they've learned, which is wonderful.
I don't know if I'm supposed to be able to jump in, Chris, but I just wanted to say I totally agree with that. That fear to offend, I think, holds us back more than any discrimination. I think that sometimes I find people don't want to do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, say the wrong word. So instead, they just don't do anything at all. So if you have a question about how you might hire somebody with a disability, or you have a question, just ask the question and move forward. So I think that's a really important point.
Amen, Stacey. And that's one of the things that we can provide, and you can provide, as Special Olympics and other neutral agencies can provide. And just listen, if you're afraid to ask the question, ask it to me, and then let's figure out if we can ask it in an open setting, to a SUNY school or to the individual directly themselves or to the business. And that way we can come to some better understanding.
Thank you, John and Stacey, for that insight. Nasli, next question, please.
Well, I think I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that question is, how do people get the training for what you are speaking of, both the employer and the persons seeking work?
Yeah, so I'll start with the employer. The employer, again, is better ready and better prepared for this because of the inclusive training they've done full circle anyway. And what the employer then needs to figure out are what are the specific job functions that they need to provide, or that they want to occur in their organization. Write those job function down, realize what they need percentage-wise, how much can they live with, and then work within our community to get those job functions provided. That's something that a hiring manager or a CEO or a sales manager or whomever is hiring is fully aware of what they need to do to get the job done. Then on our end, there are great agencies out there that have provided for years workshop employment, which we're trying to get away from workshop employment, quite frankly. But there are agencies that have individuals. We have connections to agencies around the state that have individuals, and we can make those introductions for multiple individuals to those business. Specific example, there's a granola company in Schenectady, New York that reached out to us that they just need their granola packaged. For hundreds, well, not really, tens of years, workshops in New York State have packaged materials under the workshop setting. Well, now here's an employer that's willing to pay above minimum wage. We've got people that have been trained to do it that can get out in an integrated work setting. Let's go and do that together. Fast forward to a bank, to financial institution, to corporate America. SUNY and CUNY have done a great job in educating individuals with disabilities and hidden disabilities for years. Now let's work together to be able to provide those jobs to individuals with disabilities that have been educated, right? So that's where we can together build specific training programs or work within existing training programs to be able to perform success.
Thank you, John. Nasli, do we have another question?
We do have another question that I tried to answer in the Q&A, but it's something I think the panelists will be able to offer a lot more insight on. So who determines what a reasonable accommodation is? And if there is an array of differences amongst those with disabilities, what will make it equitable?
Panel, anybody? Maybe I can start just as the moderator. What is a reasonable accommodation is determined by default. An accommodation is presumed reasonable. Any modification in program or practice or structure that provides equal access for an individual with a disability, an accommodation is presumed reasonable unless it meets one of three criteria. One, that it poses an undue hardship, either financial or administratively burdensome to a business or a higher ed institution. Secondly, that providing that accommodation constitutes a direct threat to the health and safety of others in the provision of that reasonable accommodation. And the third is, does it undermine the essential nature of the activity, including technical or program standards? If it doesn't raise any one of those red flags, then you have to presume that the accommodation is reasonable and should be provided to an individual with a disability. Now, the application of that is far more nuanced, and I'll leave, maybe some of the panelists want to weigh in.
Yeah, I would say from a higher education perspective, that at our institution, most institutions, it starts with the Center for Disabilities or Center for Accessibilities. And you would work with the particular faculty member. And oftentimes it takes creativity because once again, as I said, everybody's different. So it takes some creativity to understand what the accommodation, the reasonable accommodation needs to be. So it takes the willingness to look at the individual, to have conversations with the experts on a higher education environment, and then to figure out what the reasonable accommodation is. So it really does take some back and forth and some creativity. But I would say it starts with an absolutely clear rule that you will look for and discover a reasonable way for the student. And maybe Victoria could even talk about any experiences she's had in this arena.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, I think a lot of times when I think about the reasonable accommodation part, a lot of people, like a lot of places I've come across, and this is just in general dealing with any topic of disability discussion, is a lot of people just don't know or aren't aware of what accommodations are and what they are and what is reasonable, what's legal, what's ethical, all that stuff. A lot of people just aren't aware, and I think education is really a big key together, and I think also good communication. And I think this was mentioned and creativity, and I've had this both with classes and internships where we've had to do some good communication. I've had to, for classes, talk between instructors and the accessibility office at Buff State, and more times than not, sometimes people that aren't, you know, by the time we were, you know, maybe done having initial discussions, people sometimes will, even if they're not really immersed in the disability field or anything like that, sometimes they will be the one that can help come up with a new accommodation, and they are more than willing to help. But I think, you know, so that's just an example, but I think good communication and education are key factors early on both sides, for the business and for the person seeking accommodation. So.
Thank you, Victoria. Kathy, did you want to add?
I just, if I could just jump in for a moment, please, Dr. Rosa. I just want to say on behalf of my students and for my students, I never want to put my students in a position where they're negotiating the wrong accommodation. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down. So while creativity is certainly important, and there should be many heads at that table. It should be a multidisciplinary approach involving, you know, the student services and the academic side, and please, and the student. The student should be involved in the conversation, but they should know that they have support and they have advocacy avenues as well, so that they're not in a position where they're only advocating for themselves and they're negotiating accommodations.
Thank you, Kathy. That's a great reminder of the three pillars of the deliberative process, that ideally it should involve the students with their resonant voice and their deep understanding of what their own accommodation needs are and their ability to articulate it. The really remarkable expertise that we have in our campus disability services office, who are deeply experienced in designing effective accommodations, and of course the faculty as content experts in their own discipline and through their pedagogy to find very meaningful ways to create meaningful access, equal access in their classroom. So thank you. Natalie, any other questions from our audience?
Yes, there's been a few questions around what to do in the event of disciplinary hearings or accommodations being denied kind of situation, and how students or individual employees may navigate these kinds of policies and hearing situations like termination or misconduct hearings. So what advice do you have for individuals with disabilities struggling with their own employer or you know, their campus not providing this kind of support?
Hi. Oh, sorry. That's okay. I'm not an expert in all of this, but I think from a personal standpoint, I think about you know, the person with the disability should know who to go to if they need help with something, because I know for me, this is not something I could live if I were in that situation. Thankfully, I haven't had too many run-ins, but I have had some people not always willing to be accommodating, and I've had to ask for some help. So I think for the college standpoint, I think for me, I'm very fortunate to have good supports through the accessibility services. So I try to ask, learn my support system and who I can go to, and kind of ask for their input and advice, and you know, how I should respond first, and then you know, if further down the line they need to have more involvement, then we'll go that route. But that's my personal take on that situation.
Thank you, Victoria. John, you signaled that you wanted to weigh in.
Well, I've been reading, I'm going to pronounce it right, Rena, I'm not sure which. the question. So it sounds like there's a very specific thing going on with your question. And so I hesitate to answer a very specific question with generalities, but I will say one thing in reading the questions, and that is, I'll echo what Victoria said, communication is really important, but also there also may be something else going on in this instance. Reasonable accommodation is not an excuse not to get the job done or to misperform in a job. And so if I'm reading between the lines, could be a little bit of that. Remember, the business needs the job done. The school needs the student to learn. The individual expects to learn and to work if a reasonable accommodation is provided, if there's one hurdle in the way, right? That's the bargain that we're all in this. It doesn't, the ADA specifically and reasonable accommodation in this instance, what we're talking about, is not an excuse not to do it. And that's something that as a young person with a disability, I needed to learn. That the school was there to educate me. My employer was there to have me do a job function. Yes, reasonable accommodation can be involved, but it's not an excuse. And one of the conversations I have with individuals with disabilities and family members often is personal expectation, the expectation within yourself to do what's expected of you to do. And why should that be different for an able-bodied or a disabled individual? So I'm happy to answer your question offline privately because it does sound very nuanced. But I did want to address that today, that a big part of what we have to do is expect more from ourselves as much as anybody else when we're individuals with disabilities, because we can do more, and we should want that from ourselves if we want an equal place.
Thank you, John. And just to remind all of us that in the broadest possible strokes, if you feel as though you're experiencing discrimination or your rights are being compromised under the ADA, first of all, if it's at one of our college campuses, we all have ADA compliance officers who are responsible for reviewing complaints about discrimination or the absence of equal access. And if it can't be addressed on our campuses, the Title II of the ADA is vetted and protected by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So we're all accountable to them when it comes to compliance in the higher ed setting. When it comes to employment, if you work at one of our SUNY or CUNY colleges, you're likely covered by a collective bargaining agreement, and there are procedures for complaints or disciplinary matters to be adjudicated through the collective bargaining agreement. And of course, if you're experiencing employment discrimination in the workplace, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission enforces Title I of the ADA. So, Natalie, do we have another question?
Just some comments mentioned in the chat that I'd like to share out loud. For John mentioned that the employer should be better trained about accommodations. As a college professor who speaks to students that will become employees, coworkers, and bosses, some of them needing to request accommodations, some of them needing to understand accommodations, and some of them needing to meet accommodations. What might be a nice introduction into this for any class I might teach, as I can see that this would be helpful for all students and all fields. Someone else also said, as an instructor of therapeutic horsemanship, I often think of an individual with a disability as having an asset to entering in the field. I do work to help students gain accommodations as they need them while maintaining their privacy. How do you maintain the balance of privacy and gaining the needed accommodations?
Great question. Without putting my friend and colleague on the spot, Kathy, do you want to take a first crack at this question?
I'm sorry, I was typing an answer to Rena when you read the question.
So Kathy, how do you maintain the balance of privacy and gaining the needed accommodations?
Oh, well, I mean, on a college campus, it's somewhat easy. And I want to be careful about the terminology too. So now, so you said privacy, or whoever posed the question said privacy. So just be aware that the Americans with Disabilities Act is not a privacy act. It provides for confidentiality, which is a different standard, a higher standard actually, than privacy. So just when we talk about language, let's remember that. Where I sort of draw the line is I talk about it, and it sort of goes back to how John was framing his discussion. It goes back to talking about what the course requirements are, what the course objectives are, what work will need to be performed, rather than what the limitations, what the disability is. First of all, identifying the disability is something I don't do. I ask my students to do that themselves if we're going to have this discussion. Focusing on what sort of educational work needs to get done. And from that, we talk about what we move into the accommodation discussion. And when you sort of frame it out that way, you don't have to discuss the details of the accommodation. You certainly don't have to turn over records or information that the student has provided to establish themselves as a student with a disability and thereby entitled to protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Does that help?
Yes, I think so. I'd like to shift and ask a question to Stacey. Stacey, could you share a bit more about some of the leadership programs or post-secondary opportunities for students with mental health disabilities or intellectual or developmental disabilities as you understand them?
Yeah, sure. I don't, so Special Olympics, we don't offer those programs. What I like to say is we get our athletes ready to participate in college experiences, and a lot of schools, SUNY included, do have those experiences for those with intellectual disabilities. I think a conversation earlier that I wanted to interrupt and jump in on is, don't forget for SUNY, the good old-fashioned internship, the co-op experience, which SUNY and CUNY does so well for people with intellectual disabilities. The great way to see if something is a match, if you're, like we do for anybody, you have them intern and then you find that match and you find that connection. So I think that's a great opportunity. So at Special Olympics, what we do is we have athlete leadership programs. We have an athlete input council. We have athlete leadership programs. There's 6 or 8 week programs that we do in conjunction with the universities. University of Albany is a great partner of ours to do one of those programs. We work with the students. We do have some of our athletes who are in college programs right now. And I think those are meaningful opportunities for them. Then also, as John said, it's to get the job. What the outcome is to find meaningful employment, if that is what they wish to find. And partnering, I think, is key. Partnering with the universities, partnering with, we did New York State Industry for the Disabled, partnering with the government on different preferred sourcing projects. So that's all the stuff that we look at. And finally, I would just say, and I saw it in the chat too, so I want to just take the opportunity. It's not separate. We don't want separate. We don't want someone just talking to 75 people with disabilities, or we want them talking to everybody. So everything should be more unified. Our program should be more unified. So it's not people with disabilities over here learning and doing it and people without them over here. So any opportunities that we can find to have that inclusion, that unified experience, we look for at Special Olympics and at our partners.
Thank you, Stacey. And Ashley, thank you so much for facilitating the question and answer portion of our program. Our panel discussion has sadly come to a close. It's been a remarkable conversation, and I just wanted to thank our panelists, my partner in crime, John Graham, We'll give them a proper thank you in a moment, but it's been a privilege to be part of this discussion. Thank you for your leadership and your advocacy and sharing your insights with us today. John, back to you.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. So like any good flight, you know, we got to stick the landing. So let me just share a couple of things, high points that I was hearing, and I'm sure I've done it justice. If I did not, Chris, step in for 35 seconds to a minute if you need to. So some of the high points today were sort of transforming access and opportunity. We talked about assistive technology and the increasing need for assistive technology on our college campuses. And we also talked about the increasing and growing generation of students that are coming to our campuses and how our campuses need to be prepared for that. We talked about ADA being a very young movement, but there's evidence of progress being made, particularly in K through 12 and also in the higher education landscape. We talked quite a bit about living with disabilities and what that might entail for many individuals. But we also talked about how people with disabilities can sort of overcome barriers and a response for much needed unified generation. And we had examples of playing on the same sports teams, which is something that's equally important because it definitely shows that there's common value in that. We discussed the importance of job training skills and the intersectionality and the need for joint advocacy. We talked about the need for safe spaces and to have conversations on our campuses. And we had a great example by our student that talked about the need for workshops on campus to sort of build the campus community from all important sides. We talked about the importance of SUNY and CUNY working together, which is something that we do, and we can scale that up. And that's what we've been committed to doing. And this is just a part of that process. We talked about the importance of people living with disabilities and the need for them to ask very specific questions to prospective employers. And we need to also understand that some of the business community members are sort of afraid to offend. And so there's a need for a much broader conversation. And I think that that's beginning to take place at various levels. And we want to make sure that that happens to become a new normal. We discussed the need to increase training by employers and also engage hiring managers in the workplace so that they can be a little bit more sensitive and self-aware of the need for that type of diversity that they claim that they're seeking. I just would like to just give a very, very special thanks to all of the panelists, you know, and all the participants who are with us today. I think you all did an amazing job. And I kind of wanted to just underscore this one point that was made towards the end about sort of athletes with disabilities and how they can sort of benefit from internships and cooperative experiences. And this is something that Nasli and I talk about sometimes in the building, although we're in a virtual building now. But she and I have had conversations, hard conversations, and I said, Nasli, we need to see students with disabilities in the building, among our colleagues, our staff, and it needs to become a part of the new normal. We have to do everything we possibly can to ensure that the things that we're saying is being modeled across our system. And so with that, I just would like to just make a quick little note here that this conversation is being recorded. And so this information will be shared with you, and then we'll be providing additional feedback and appropriate updates over time. Chris, I don't know if you need to have a final word, but those are my sort of closing remarks.
John, I think it was extraordinarily well said. Thank you for taking us on this journey today.